Sometimes life teaches us that help comes from the last person we'd expect. In moments of true crisis, pride becomes our greatest enemy, and wisdom often wears the simplest clothes. In 1883, Victoria Pembroke was traveling to her family's ranch when small bumps began appearing on her face. At first, she thought nothing of it, just irritation from the mountain air. But the bumps spread quickly, turning her beautiful face into something she barely recognized. Her wealthy companions told her it was nothing serious. They were wrong. Frank Rivers, a rough mountain man, took one look at her condition and knew she was in deadly danger. He recognized the signs of a rare disease that could kill her within days. But Victoria was too proud to listen to a simple mountain man. Would she swallow her pride before it was too late? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning sun cast long shadows across the Colorado Territory as Victoria Pembroke's elaborate caravan wound its way through the mountain passes. Her silver-backed hand mirror caught the light as she examined her reflection for the third time that hour, fingertips tracing the small bumps that had appeared overnight on her left cheek. The mirror had been her grandmother's, a wedding gift from a Boston merchant family whose wealth had built railways and funded expeditions across the continent. "Just the mountain air, Miss Victoria," assured Mrs. Whitfield, her personal attendant of 15 years. The older woman's weathered hands smoothed Victoria's silk traveling dress, her voice carrying the same confidence that had guided Victoria through countless social functions back in Boston. "You know how delicate your skin has always been." Victoria nodded, though something deeper than vanity troubled her. At 28, she had lived a life cushioned by privileged boarding schools in Switzerland, summers in Newport, winters in the finest hotels from New York to San Francisco. Her father, Edmund Pembroke, owned half the silver mines in Colorado and had built the family fortune on the backs of men who worked in darkness while his daughter danced in ballrooms lit by crystal chandeliers. The caravan itself spoke of that wealth. 4 ornate carriages carried her belongings, each one worth more than most frontier families saw in a lifetime. Her traveling party included Mrs. Whitfield, Dr. Cornelius Webb, a pompous man from Philadelphia who had insisted on accompanying her for medical safety, 3 armed guards, 2 drivers, and a cook who had trained in French kitchens before seeking adventure in the American West. Victoria had never traveled this far into untamed country before. Her previous trips to the family's Colorado holdings had involved railroad cars and established hotels. But this summer, her father had requested she visit their newest acquisition, a sprawling ranch that bordered the wilderness where few civilized souls dared to venture. It was to be her inheritance, he had explained, and she needed to understand the land that would someday bear her children and carry on the Pembroke name. The landscape around them seemed to stretch endlessly toward jagged peaks that scraped the sky like broken teeth. Pine trees clung to impossible slopes, and the air carried scents she had no names for, something wild and clean that made her lungs work harder than they ever had in the drawing rooms of Boston society. Despite her discomfort with the primitive conditions, Victoria found herself drawn to the raw beauty of this place. There was something honest about mountains that couldn't be bought or influenced by family connections. 20 miles behind them, moving silently through terrain that would challenge experienced hunters, Frank Rivers tracked their progress with the patient attention of a man who had learned to read the wilderness like other men read newspapers. His leather-bound journal, worn smooth by years of handling, contained observations that would have impressed university professors, detailed notes about weather patterns, plant medicine, animal behavior, and the 100 subtle signs that meant the difference between life and death in country that showed no mercy to the unprepared. Frank had been watching the fancy caravan since yesterday morning, not from any ill intent, but because movement through his territory always caught his attention. In 15 years of mountain living, he had learned that survival meant knowing everything that happened within a day's walk of his cabin. The elaborate procession troubled him. Too many people, too much noise, and far too much confidence for country that could kill the careless without warning. At 45, Frank carried himself with the quiet competence of a man who had seen both the best and worst that life could offer. His hands, scarred from countless encounters with tools, weather, and necessity, could field dress an elk or perform delicate medical procedures with equal skill. His grey eyes missed nothing, the way the lead horse favoured its left front leg, the inexperience of the guards who scanned the horizon instead of watching the ground for signs of trouble, and most importantly, the woman in the finest carriage who kept touching her face with increasing frequency. Frank's cabin sat hidden in a grove of aspens 3 miles from any trail, built with his own hands from logs he had cut and stones he had quarried. Inside, shelves lined every wall, filled with books that might surprise anyone who judged him by his rough appearance. Medical texts sat beside works of philosophy, and journals of botanical observations shared space with volumes of poetry that had helped him through the darkest years of self-imposed exile. The journal he carried had been his companion through those years, filled with sketches of medicinal plants, notes about animal behaviors that predicted weather changes, and increasingly, observations about the human cost of isolation. Frank had chosen this life after losing everything that mattered to him, but lately, the silence had begun to feel more like punishment than peace. He had been Dr. Franklin Rivers once, a respected army surgeon who had saved hundreds of lives during the Indian Wars. But one terrible winter, when a cholera outbreak swept through his military post, his medical knowledge had proved insufficient. The disease had taken his patients, his colleagues, and finally his own wife Sarah and their 6-year-old daughter Anna. The official inquiry had cleared him of wrongdoing, but Frank could not clear himself. He had walked away from medicine, from civilization, from everything that reminded him of his failures. Now, watching Victoria's caravan through his field glasses, Frank felt the familiar weight of medical instincts he could never quite silence. Something about the woman's behavior, the frequency with which she examined her reflection, the way she held herself slightly apart from her companions, suggested symptoms that her wealthy traveling party might not recognize until too late. The bumps on Victoria's face had multiplied during the morning hours, spreading from her left cheek to her chin and the delicate skin around her eyes. Dr. Webb had examined her briefly during their noon rest stop, pronouncing it nothing more than an allergic reaction to the mountain environment. His confidence had reassured her companions, but Victoria felt a growing unease that had nothing to do with vanity, and everything to do with the burning sensation that seemed to intensify with each passing hour. "Perhaps we should consider stopping for the day," suggested Mrs. Whitfield as Victoria emerged from her carriage for their afternoon rest. "You look peaked, dear." Victoria caught her reflection in the carriage window and barely suppressed a gasp. The bumps had darkened and seemed to pulse with their own rhythm. More alarming still, similar lesions had begun appearing on her hands and wrists, angry red marks that itched and burned, despite Dr. Webb's promised remedies. "Nonsense," declared Dr. Webb, mopping his perspiring forehead with a silk handkerchief. "A good night's rest and some of my special powder will clear this right up. I've seen similar reactions in patients who venture too far from civilized climates. The body simply needs time to adjust." But Frank Rivers, watching from his hidden position among the trees, recognized symptoms that made his blood run cold. The rapid spread, the distinctive pattern, the way the woman held herself as though even her clothing caused discomfort, all pointed to a condition he had seen before, in army camps, where poor sanitation and close quarters created perfect conditions for rare diseases to flourish. If he was right, the woman had, perhaps days before the condition became life-threatening. If he was right, her fancy doctor with his silk handkerchiefs and pompous manner had no idea what he was dealing with. And if he was right, Frank faced a choice that would force him to confront everything he had spent 15 years trying to forget. As the sun began its descent toward the western peaks, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson, Frank made his decision. He would approach the camp under cover of darkness, not to interfere, but to confirm what his experienced eye already suspected. After that, whether the proud woman in her fine carriage lived or died would depend on whether she could swallow her pride long enough to trust a man the wilderness had taught to heal. Victoria woke before dawn to a sensation that made her stomach lurch with terror. The burning had spread overnight, transforming from mild discomfort to genuine agony that seemed to pulse with her heartbeat. She reached for her hand mirror with trembling fingers, and what she saw in the barred, pale morning light made her bite back a scream. The lesions had multiplied and darkened, covering most of her face in angry, weeping sores that made her barely recognizable. Her silk gloves, which she had worn to bed in a desperate attempt to hide the spreading marks on her hands, were stained with fluid that had seeped through the expensive fabric. The woman staring back at her from the mirror looked like something from a nightmare, her once porcelain skin now a map of disease that seemed to mock every privilege she had ever taken for granted. "Mrs. Whitfield," she called, her voice hoarse with pain and fear. "Please, come quickly." Her attendant's gasp upon seeing her told Victoria everything she needed to know about how dramatically her condition had deteriorated. Mrs. Whitfield, who had weathered everything from Victoria's childhood tantrums to her father's business crises with unflappable composure, stood frozen in the tent, opening with her hand pressed to her mouth. "Fetch Dr. Webb immediately," Victoria whispered, pulling a shawl around her face to hide the worst of the damage. "And please, don't let anyone else see me like this, Doctor." Webb arrived 20 minutes later, his usual pompous confidence notably absent as he examined Victoria's condition in the privacy of her tent. His hands shook slightly as he lifted her chin to study the lesions, and Victoria caught the flicker of uncertainty that crossed his features before he composed himself. "Well now," he said, his voice pitched higher than usual, "this is certainly more extensive than I anticipated, but not to worry, mountain fever can present in many unusual ways. A few days of rest and proper medication should see you right." But Victoria saw through his forced reassurance. "Dr. Webb, please speak honestly. What exactly is wrong with me?" The doctor cleared his throat, avoiding her eyes. "My dear woman, medical diagnosis requires careful consideration. These frontier conditions make proper examination difficult. I'm certain that once we reach civilization—" "How long until we reach the ranch?" Victoria interrupted. "Another 4 days, perhaps 5 if the weather turns." Victoria felt something cold settle in her chest. 4 days felt like a lifetime when each hour brought new lesions and deeper pain. She had never been seriously ill in her life, never faced anything more threatening than a seasonal cold, and the reality of her vulnerability in this remote place crashed over her like an avalanche. Outside her tent, the camp stirred to life with the usual morning routine, but Victoria could hear whispered conversations that stopped abruptly whenever footsteps approached her quarters. Word of her condition was spreading, and she could imagine the fear and uncertainty rippling through her traveling party. It was Thomas Clearwater, her head guard, who first spotted the lone figure approaching their camp. The man emerged from the tree line like morning mist given form, tall, weathered, moving with the silent confidence of someone completely at home in the wilderness. He wore simple buckskin clothing and carried himself with a dignity that seemed at odds with his rough appearance. "Hold there, stranger," Clearwater called, his hand moving instinctively to his sidearm. "State your business." Frank Rivers stopped 50 yards from the camp, his hands visible and empty. "Names?" "Frank Rivers. I've been watching your party, and I believe one of your people is in serious trouble." "We don't need help from drifters," Clearwater replied sharply. "Move along." But Frank didn't move. Instead, he raised his voice so it would carry to the tents beyond. "The woman with the lesions on her face, how quickly are they spreading? Are they weeping? Does she have fever?" The questions hung in the morning air like smoke from a campfire. Victoria, listening from inside her tent, felt her breath catch. This stranger had described her condition with an accuracy that, Dr. Webb's vague reassurances couldn't match. Dr. Webb emerged from Victoria's tent at that moment, his face flushed with indignation. "How dare you disturb our camp with such impertinence? I am a trained physician, and I'll thank you to keep your frontier superstitions to yourself." Frank studied the doctor with the same careful attention he gave to animal tracks or weather signs. "What's your diagnosis, doctor?" "Mountain fever, obviously, a common condition that requires rest and proper medication. Mountain fever doesn't cause the pattern of lesions I observed through my field glasses," Frank said quietly. "What you're dealing with is likely cutaneous lupus, possibly triggered by sun exposure and stress. Left untreated, it can become systemic within days." The medical terminology spoken with calm authority from this rough mountain man created a stunned silence around the camp. "Doctor." Webb's face cycled through several shades of red before he found his voice. "Preposterous! A common vagrant cannot possibly. I can describe exactly what those lesions look like," Frank interrupted. "Raised, circular, with a darker border, spreading in a butterfly pattern across the face, accompanied by joint pain and fatigue that the patient is trying to hide." Victoria pushed aside the tent flap, her face still partially concealed by her shawl. The stranger's description matched her symptoms perfectly, down to details she hadn't mentioned to anyone. "How could you possibly know that?" Frank met her eyes with a steadiness that seemed to offer something, "Doctor." Webb's bluster could not genuine competence. "Because I've seen it before, ma'am, and I know that time is not your friend right now." "This is ridiculous, Doctor," Webb sputtered. "Thomas, remove this person from our camp immediately." But Victoria stepped forward, ignoring the shocked gasps from her traveling party as they saw her ravaged face in full daylight. The lesions had indeed formed the butterfly pattern Frank described, and the pain in her joints had been building steadily since dawn. "What would you recommend?" she asked Frank directly. "Immediate treatment with specific plant medicines found in these mountains, anti-inflammatory compounds that can slow the progression, and most importantly, getting you out of direct sunlight, which is making the condition worse." Dr. Webb laughed harshly. "Plant medicines, madam. You cannot seriously consider taking medical advice from a mountain hermit who probably learned his knowledge from Indian shamans." The dismissal was intended to end the conversation, but Frank's response carried a weight that made everyone pause. "Ma'am, you have perhaps 2 days before this condition becomes life-threatening. Your doctor's mountain fever diagnosis means he doesn't understand what you're facing." "I do." Victoria looked back and forth between the two men, one representing everything familiar and safe about her world, the other offering knowledge that might actually save her life. The choice should have been simple, but the evidence of her worsening condition made it terrifyingly complex. "We're leaving," Dr. Webb announced. "Strike the camp. We'll reach proper medical facilities where this woman can receive appropriate care." As the camp began to bustle with packing activity, Frank retreated to the tree line, but his voice carried clearly to Victoria as she stood frozen between two impossible choices. "I'll be following at a distance, ma'am. When you're ready to listen to someone who actually knows what's killing you, I'll be close enough to help." Victoria touched her ravaged face through the silk gloves, feeling the heat of the lesions against the expensive fabric. Her entire world had been built on the assumption that money and social position could solve any problem, but standing in this remote wilderness with a disease that was transforming her body into something unrecognizable, she began to understand that some challenges required a different kind of expertise altogether. By midday, Victoria's condition had deteriorated so dramatically that even Dr. Webb's forced optimism began to crack. The lesions had spread down her neck and across her shoulders, and the fever that accompanied them left her weak and disoriented. She slumped in her carriage, no longer able to maintain the composed posture that had been drilled into her since childhood. "Perhaps we should consider making camp early today, Mrs. Whitfield suggested quietly to Dr. Webb as Victoria dozed fitfully. "She's burning up, and the jostling of the carriage seems to be making things worse." "Doctor," Webb mopped his brow, his confidence visibly shaken. Yes, yes, of course. Rest is essential for recovery. We'll stop at the next suitable location. Behind them, moving silently through terrain that would challenge even experienced frontiersmen, Frank Rivers continued his distant surveillance. In his weathered hands, he carried a pressed wildflower, a delicate mountain bloom his daughter Anna had picked for him during their last walk together, 15 years ago. He kept it now between the pages of his medical journal, a reminder of the life he had failed to save and the knowledge he had gained too late to matter. Frank's past was written in the scars on his hands and the careful way he moved through the world. He had been Dr. Franklin Rivers once, a name spoken with respect in military hospitals from Virginia to California. His medical training had been exceptional, Johns Hopkins, followed by advanced surgical studies in Edinburgh. When the army recruited him, they had promised adventure and the chance to serve his country while practicing medicine on the frontier. Those had been good years, before everything went wrong. Frank had saved countless lives in battlefield conditions that would have broken lesser physicians. He had learned to operate by candlelight, to set bones with improvised splints, to fight infections with whatever medicines could be found or foraged. His fellow officers had called him a miracle worker, and Frank had believed them. But miracles had limits, as he learned during the winter of 1868, when cholera swept through Fort Davidson like wildfire. Despite his best efforts, despite every technique he had mastered and every remedy he could devise, the disease had taken nearly half the garrison. Worse, it had taken Sarah and Anna, who had been visiting the fort when the outbreak began. Frank had worked for 72 hours straight, trying to save everyone he could, but the disease moved faster than his knowledge. When Sarah died in his arms, her skin cold, despite the fever that had consumed her, Frank had felt something fundamental break inside him. When Anna followed her mother 3 days later, her small hand clutched around the wildflower she had picked for him, Frank had simply walked away from everything he had ever been. The official inquiry had cleared him of any wrongdoing. Cholera was a known risk on the frontier, and his response had been textbook perfect. But Frank carried a guilt that no military tribunal could absolve. He had been the doctor, the one with the knowledge and training, and he had failed the two people who mattered most. Now, watching Victoria's elegant caravan from his hidden position among the pine trees, Frank felt the familiar weight of medical responsibility settling on his shoulders. The symptoms he observed through his field glasses were unmistakable: the butterfly rash across her face, the way she held her joints as though they ached, the fever flush that was visible even at a distance. Without proper treatment, she would follow the same trajectory as the patients he had lost 15 years ago. The irony wasn't lost on him. Here was a woman who represented everything he had walked away from: wealth, privilege, the assumption that money could solve any problem, yet she was dying of a condition he could treat if she could overcome her pride long enough to trust a man her world would dismiss as a worthless vagrant. Late in the afternoon, as Victoria's caravan made camp beside a mountain stream, Frank observed something that confirmed his worst fears. One of the carriage horses had developed a slight limp, favoring its left front leg in a way that suggested a stone bruise or possible infection. It was a minor injury in normal circumstances, but on the frontier, a lame horse could mean the difference between life and death. Thomas Clearwater, the head guard, was examining the animal with the uncertain movements of a man who knew enough about horses to recognize a problem, but not enough to solve it. Frank watched the guard's clumsy attempts at diagnosis for several minutes before making a decision that would bring him closer to the camp than prudence would normally dictate. Moving with the silent skill that 15 years of mountain living had taught him, Frank approached the horse from the blind side of the camp. The animal sensed his presence immediately, but instead of shying away, it seemed to calm under his experienced touch. Frank had always been good with animals. They responded to the quiet confidence that came from understanding rather than force. "Easy, girl," he murmured, running his hands down the horse's leg with practiced efficiency. "Let's see what's troubling you." It was a simple stone bruise, easily treated with proper care. Frank worked quickly, using techniques he had learned from army veterinarians who knew that cavalry horses were often more valuable than the soldiers who rode them. Within minutes, he had the stone removed and was applying a poultice made from plants he carried in his medicine bag. "What the hell do you think you're doing?" Thomas Clearwater's voice cut through the evening air like a whip crack. The guard stood 20 feet away, his hand on his pistol, face flushed with anger and embarrassment at being caught off guard. Frank straightened, slowly, his hands visible and unthreatening. "Your mare had a stone bruise. It's been treated. She'll be fine to travel tomorrow if you keep the hoof clean and dry. I told you to stay away from this camp," Clearwater snarled. "Mrs. Pembroke doesn't need help from mountain trash." "No," Frank replied quietly, "but her horse did. And unless I'm mistaken, Mrs. Pembroke herself needs help more than she's willing to admit." The commotion had drawn attention from the rest of the camp. "Doctor." Webb emerged from his tent with his usual bluster, but Victoria herself appeared at the flap of her shelter, her face now so ravaged by lesions that even her silk scarves couldn't fully conceal the damage. Frank met her eyes across the distance, and in that moment, he saw something that reminded him powerfully of his daughter Anna in her final hours, a flicker of fear that all the privilege and wealth in the world couldn't diminish. It was the look of someone beginning to understand that they were truly, desperately mortal. "The horse will be fine," Frank called to her, his voice carrying clearly in the still mountain air. "But, Mom, you need to know that your condition is progressing faster than your doctor realizes. Time is becoming critical." Victoria's hand rose instinctively to her ravaged cheek, and for a moment, Frank thought she might actually listen. "But Doctor," Webb's sharp command cut through the possibility. "Thomas, remove this person immediately. Use force if necessary." As the guards moved toward him, Frank melted back into the forest with the same silent efficiency that had brought him to the camp. But his parting words followed him into the darkness, carrying a weight of knowledge that Victoria would find increasingly difficult to ignore. "I'll be close when you're ready to choose life over pride, Mom. Don't wait too long." The pain that woke Victoria in the depths of night was unlike anything she had ever experienced. It felt as though fire ants were crawling beneath her skin, each movement sending fresh waves of agony through her joints. She lay in her bedroll, biting her lip to keep from crying out, while fever chills racked her body despite the summer warmth. Through the thin canvas of her tent, she could hear Mrs. Whitfield's worried whispers to Dr. Webb. Their voices carried clearly in the still mountain air, and what Victoria heard made her blood run cold. "She's burning up, Doctor. The fever's been climbing for hours, and those sores, they're weeping something terrible. I've never seen anything like it." Dr. Webb's response lacked his usual pompous certainty. "Mountain conditions can produce unusual presentations. We must trust that proper rest and medication will see her through this crisis." But what if that mountain man was right? What if this isn't mountain fever at all? Nonsense. The man's clearly a vagrant with no formal medical training. I won't have my professional judgment questioned by frontier superstition. Victoria pressed her face into her pillow, feeling the rough fabric against her ravaged skin. Mrs. Whitfield's doubts echoed her own growing fears. The treatment, Doctor. Webb had prescribed rest, laudanum for pain, and a bitter powder he claimed would reduce inflammation, had done nothing to slow the progression of her condition. If anything, she felt worse with each passing hour. In his hidden camp a mile away, Frank Rivers sat by a small fire, grinding medicinal plants with the patient precision of someone who understood that lives often depended on such details. His Native American medicine pouch, worn soft by years of use, contained herbs he had learned to identify from the Cheyenne medicine man who had taught him the healing properties of mountain flora during his first desperate years in the wilderness. The knowledge had come hard-won. After abandoning his medical practice, Frank had nearly died that first winter, too proud and too broken to seek help from anyone. It was 3 Bears, an elderly Cheyenne healer, who had found him half frozen in a snowdrift and nursed him back to health. The old man had seen past Frank's grief to the physician underneath and had spent 2 years teaching him how the earth itself could heal. "The plants know things your books do not teach," 3 Bears had said in his careful English, "but books know things the plants cannot cure alone. Wise man learns from both." Frank had learned, combining his formal medical training with ancient knowledge that predated hospitals and universities by thousands of years. The result was an understanding of healing that few men possessed the ability to see patterns and connections that escaped both traditional doctors and traditional healers. Now, as he prepared medicines that could save Victoria's life, Frank found himself thinking about the fragile young woman who was dying while her companions clung to their prejudices. In her fevered face, he saw echoes of every patient he had lost, but also the possibility of redemption that had eluded him for 15 years. Dawn was still hours away when Mrs. Whitfield made a decision that would change everything. Unable to bear watching Victoria's suffering any longer, she slipped from the camp and made her way toward the tree line where she had seen the mountain man disappear. "Mr. Rivers," she called softly into the darkness, "I know you're out there. Please, I need to speak with you." Frank materialized from the shadows with the silent grace that had become second nature. In the pale starlight, Mrs. Whitfield could see the intelligence in his eyes, something that contradicted every assumption she had made about his character. "How is she?" Frank asked without preamble. "Dying, I think," Mrs. Whitfield replied honestly. "The fever's getting worse, and those sores, they're like nothing I've ever seen. Doctor, Webb keeps saying it's mountain fever, but I've nursed mountain fever before. This is something else entirely." Frank nodded grimly. "Cutaneous lupus, triggered by sun exposure and stress. Without proper treatment, it can become systemic, attacking her organs, her joints, her nervous system." "How long has she been this sick?" 3 days since the first bumps appeared, but it's moving so fast." "Too fast," Frank agreed. "The high altitude and intense sun exposure are accelerating the progression. She needs immediate treatment with specific anti-inflammatory compounds, plants that grow in these mountains." Mrs. Whitfield studied his face in the starlight. "You really are a doctor, aren't you?" "Was," Frank corrected quietly. "Long time ago, but you still know how to help her." "I know how to try. But Mrs. Whitfield, you need to understand something. Even if I could treat her condition, the people she's traveling with will never accept help from someone like me. They'd rather let her die than admit a mountain hermit knows more about medicine than their fancy Philadelphia doctor." Mrs. Whitfield was quiet for a long moment, wrestling with loyalties that had been 15 years in the making. Finally, she spoke with the quiet determination of someone who had made an irrevocable choice. "What if she didn't know? What if I brought her the medicine without telling her where it came from?" Frank shook his head. "It's not that simple. The treatment requires careful monitoring, precise dosing based on her response. And most importantly, she needs to be kept out of direct sunlight completely. One more day of sun exposure in her current condition could trigger a systemic crisis that would kill her within hours." "Then tell me what to do. I'll watch her. I'll follow your instructions exactly. Just please. She's like a daughter to me. I can't watch her die when there might be help." Frank studied the older woman's face, seeing the same desperate love he had once felt for his own child. It was a look that cut through 15 years of self-imposed isolation and touched something he thought he had buried forever. "There's a grove of aspen trees about a quarter-mile upstream. Meet me there in an hour. Bring clean cloth for bandages and any willow bark extract you might have in your medical supplies. And Mrs. Whitfield, if we do this, there's no going back. Your doctor, Webb, will know the medicines didn't come from his bag." "I don't care about Dr. Webb," she replied fiercely. "I care about that girl in there who's burning up with fever while he stands around talking about mountain conditions and proper rest." As Mrs. Whitfield made her way back to camp, Frank began gathering the plants he would need: willow bark for its natural anti-inflammatory properties, echinacea for immune support, and most critically, a rare high-altitude moss that contained compounds similar to modern corticosteroids. It was dangerous medicine, requiring precise knowledge and careful monitoring, but it was Victoria's only chance. The irony wasn't lost on him. After 15 years of running from his calling, Frank was about to practice medicine again. The question was whether a proud socialite would trust her life to treatments she couldn't understand, administered in secret by a man her world considered beneath notice. The secret treatment began before dawn, in the hushed darkness of Victoria's tent, where Mrs. Whitfield administered the first dose of Frank's carefully prepared medicine. Victoria was delirious with fever, her skin burning to the touch, barely conscious enough to swallow the bitter herbal mixture that Frank had brewed from plants she would never have imagined could heal. "What is this?" Victoria whispered through cracked lips, her voice barely audible above the sound of her labored breathing. "Something to help with the fever, dear." Mrs. Whitfield replied gently, supporting Victoria's head as she coaxed her to drink the rest of the preparation. Dr. Webb thought it might be beneficial. It was a necessary lie, one that Mrs. Whitfield justified by the desperate circumstances. Victoria was too ill to question the source of relief, and Dr. Webb was too proud to admit he might be wrong about anything. The deception felt wrong to Mrs. Whitfield's honest nature, but watching Victoria's suffering had convinced her that conventional propriety was a luxury they could no longer afford. Within hours, the medicine began to work. The angry inflammation that had made Victoria's skin feel like it was on fire started to subside, and the fever that had racked her body for days began to break. For the first time since her ordeal began, Victoria slept peacefully, her breathing deep and regular, instead of the shallow gasps that had terrified her companions. Frank monitored her progress from his hidden position, using field glasses to observe the subtle signs that would tell him whether his treatment was working. The slight relaxation in her posture, the way Mrs. Whitfield's shoulders lost some of their tension as she emerged from the tent, these were the indicators that mattered more than any formal medical examination. But success brought its own complications. Dr. Webb, who had been preparing himself for the worst, was both relieved and puzzled by Victoria's sudden improvement. He examined her during the morning hours, noting the reduced inflammation and broken fever with the satisfaction of a man taking credit for a miracle he didn't understand. "Excellent progress," he announced to the worried traveling party. "The crisis has passed, exactly as I predicted. Proper rest and appropriate medication have done their work." Mrs. Whitfield said nothing, but Frank could see the tension in her movements as she went about her duties. The success of the secret treatment had bought them time, but it had also created a dangerous situation. Frank's medicine was powerful, but required careful monitoring and regular dosing. One mistreatment could send Victoria back into crisis, and any change in her care routine would eventually raise questions that Mrs. Whitfield couldn't answer. As the caravan prepared to resume their journey, Frank made a decision that went against every survival instinct he had developed during his years of isolation. He would have to get close enough to provide proper medical care, close enough to monitor Victoria's condition directly, and close enough to risk exposure as the fraud Dr. Webb believed him to be. The opportunity came when Thomas Clearwater's horse developed the same type of stone bruise that Frank had treated the day before. This time, however, the guard's inexpert attempts to address the problem had made it worse, and the animal was clearly in pain. Frank approached the camp openly this time, walking directly toward the struggling guard with the confident manner of someone who belonged exactly where he was. "Having trouble with your horse, friend?" Clearwater looked up with a mixture of embarrassment and hostility. "Nothing I can't handle." "Course not," Frank agreed mildly. "But that mare's favoring her left front pretty badly. Might want to check for gravel in the frog." Despite his pride, Clearwater was practical enough to recognize expertise when he saw it. Frank's treatment of the previous day's problem had been both effective and gentle, qualities that were rare among the rough men who typically worked the frontier. After a moment's hesitation, he stepped aside. Frank worked with the quiet efficiency that had made him legendary in army medical circles. his scarred hands moving with the precise delicacy of a surgeon. As he cleaned and treated the horse's injured hoof, he found himself thinking about his military medal, a piece of tarnished silver that lay hidden in his cabin, representing honors he no longer felt he deserved. The medal had been awarded after the Battle of Little Bear Creek, where Frank had operated for 18 straight hours to save wounded soldiers under enemy fire. He had been 28. Then, full of confidence in his abilities and his mission, the citation praised his extraordinary heroism in the face of overwhelming odds and his dedication to preserving life under the most challenging circumstances. Frank had treasured that medal once, seeing it as validation of his choice to serve his country as a healer rather than a warrior. But after losing Sarah and Anna, the medal had become a mockery, a reminder that all his heroism and dedication meant nothing when the people who mattered most needed him. Now, as he worked to heal another creature's pain, Frank felt the familiar weight of responsibility settling on his shoulders. Victoria's improvement was temporary without continued treatment, and the deception that had saved her life so far was becoming increasingly dangerous. Dr. Webb was taking credit for a recovery he couldn't explain, which meant he would resist any suggestion that his patient needed different care. "You've got a gift with animals," Clearwater admitted grudgingly as Frank finished his work. "Where'd you learn to do that?" "Army," Frank replied simply. "Cavalry horses were worth their weight in gold. Learned to keep them healthy." It was true enough, though it left out the medical training that made him understand anatomy and healing in ways that went far beyond veterinary care. Frank had learned early in his exile that people were more comfortable with partial truths than complete honesty about his background. As the caravan prepared to move on, Frank caught Mrs. Whitfield's eye and gave an almost imperceptible nod toward a stand of pine trees ahead of their route. She understood immediately he would be waiting there with the next dose of medicine that Victoria would need by evening. But Victoria herself was beginning to notice things that troubled her. The medicine that had brought such relief tasted unlike anything in Dr. Webb's usual arsenal, and Mrs. Whitfield's explanations about new treatments felt oddly evasive. Moreover, Victoria was intelligent enough to recognize that her recovery, while dramatic, was far from complete. The underlying condition that had nearly killed her was still there, held in check by something she didn't understand. As her carriage rolled through the mountain landscape, Victoria found herself watching the tree line with new attention. Somewhere out there was the mountain man who had tried to warn her about her condition, the same man who had demonstrated medical knowledge that seemed to exceed Dr. Webb's understanding. For the first time since her ordeal began, Victoria started to wonder if her survival might depend on questioning everything she had been taught about who deserved her trust. Victoria's suspicions crystallized on the third day of her mysterious recovery, when she caught Mrs. Whitfield disposing of something behind her tent in the pre-dawn darkness. Through her tent flap, Victoria watched her loyal attendant bury what appeared to be plant material and empty vials in a small hole, covering the evidence with practiced efficiency that suggested this wasn't the first time. "Mrs. Whitfield," Victoria called softly as her attendant crept back toward the tent. "Please come here." The older woman froze like a child caught in mischief, her face cycling through several expressions before settling on resigned determination. She entered the tent and knelt beside Victoria's bedroll, her weathered hands clasped tightly in her lap. "You've been giving me something that doesn't come from Dr. Webb's bag, haven't you?" Victoria asked quietly. Mrs. Whitfield's shoulders sagged with the weight of discovered deception. "Yes, Miss Victoria, I have. Something from the mountain man? Frank Rivers, yes. Miss Victoria, I know how this must seem, but you were dying. Dr. Webb's treatments weren't working, and Mr. Rivers, he knew exactly what was wrong with you. He saved your life." Victoria lay back against her pillows, processing this revelation that turned everything she thought she understood upside down. Her recovery, which Dr. Webb had attributed to his expert care was actually the result of treatment by a man her entire party had dismissed as a vagrant. The irony was as bitter as the medicine that had saved her life. "Tell me about him," Victoria said finally. "The truth this time." Mrs. Whitfield glanced toward the tent opening, then leaned closer to speak in whispers. "He was a doctor once, a real one, army surgeon. He knows things about healing that go beyond anything I've ever seen. The plants he uses, the way he combines them, it's like watching magic, but it's really just knowledge. Then why is he living like a hermit in the mountains? Lost his family, from what I can gather. Wife and daughter died in some kind of epidemic, and he blamed himself. Been hiding up here ever since." Victoria absorbed this information, feeling something shift in her understanding of the man who had tried to help her. She had dismissed him as a rough frontier vagrant, but the truth was far more complex. He was a trained physician who had chosen exile over practicing the medicine that reminded him of his greatest failure. The pearl necklace around Victoria's throat, a family heirloom passed down through 3 generations of Pembroke women, suddenly felt heavy with symbolic weight. Her grandmother had worn it to her wedding, her mother to social functions that shaped Boston society, and Victoria had worn it as a symbol of her place in a world built on wealth and privilege. Now, lying in a tent in the Colorado wilderness, with her life saved by someone her world would never acknowledge, the necklace seemed to represent everything shallow and meaningless about the values she had never questioned. "I need to see him," Victoria said suddenly. "Mr. Rivers, I need to thank him properly." Mrs. Whitfield shook her head firmly. "Too dangerous, miss. If the others found out about the treatment, they'd be furious. And Mr. Rivers, he's been taking terrible risks just to help you. If Thomas Clearwater catches him near the camp again, then we'll have to be careful," Victoria interrupted. "Mrs. Whitfield, this man saved my life, while I was too proud to even listen to him. I can't let that debt go unpaid." But their conversation was interrupted by voices outside the tent, Dr. Webb and Thomas Clearwater discussing something that made both women freeze with sudden fear. "I'm telling you, Doctor, something's not right," Clearwater was saying. "Miss Pembroke's recovery is too sudden, too complete. Yesterday she was near death, and today she's asking for solid food and wanting to sit up. That's not how mountain fever works." Dr. Webb's voice carried a defensive edge. "Recovery can often appear dramatic when proper treatment is applied. I've seen similar cases." "Have you?" Clearwater interrupted. "Because I've been thinking about what that mountain man said. About cutaneous lupus and butterfly patterns and sun exposure. Seems like he knew an awful lot about Miss Pembroke's specific symptoms." Victoria felt her blood turn cold. If Clearwater's suspicions led to discovery of the secret treatment, it would mean more than embarrassment. It could mean a return to the deadly progression of her condition without the medicine that was keeping her alive. "Thomas," Dr. Webb said with forced patience, "I understand your concern, but I won't have my professional competence questioned based on the ravings of a frontier vagrant. Miss Pembroke is recovering because of proper medical care, nothing more. Then explain the plant material I found buried behind her tent this morning." The silence that followed this statement seemed to stretch for an eternity. Victoria could hear her own heartbeat in her ears as she realized that Clearwater had discovered evidence of the secret treatment. Mrs. Whitfield reached for Victoria's hand, squeezing it with quiet reassurance. But both women knew they were facing exposure that could have devastating consequences. Dr. Webb's professional pride would never allow him to admit that his patient had been saved by someone he had dismissed as incompetent. "And if the treatment stopped, I want that mountain man found," Clearwater continued. "I want to know exactly what he's been doing around this camp. And I want to know why Miss Pembroke's mystery recovery coincides with his presence in the area." Victoria made a decision that surprised even herself. Rising from her bedroll with strength that had returned thanks to Frank's medicine, she pushed aside the tent flap and emerged into the morning sunlight. Her face, while still marked by healing lesions, was dramatically improved from the ravaged condition of just days before. "Gentlemen," she said, with all the authority that generations of Pembroke wealth and influence could command, "I believe you're discussing my medical care without consulting me." "Doctor." Webb stammered something about patient rest and proper protocols, but Victoria cut him off with a gesture that would have done credit to her grandmother at her most imperious. "Mr. Clearwater, you mentioned finding plant material. I'd like to see it. Please." Clearwater produced a small collection of dried herbs and empty glass vials, evidence that could destroy the careful deception that had saved Victoria's life. She examined them with the cool composure that had been bred into her bones, while internally calculating odds and consequences with the sharp intelligence that had made her family's fortune. "Dr. Webb," she said finally, "I believe it's time we had a frank discussion about my treatment and prognosis." Victoria's confrontation with Dr. Webb never had the chance to unfold as she had planned. Just as she opened her mouth to speak, her vision blurred suddenly and her legs buckled beneath her. The dramatic improvement in her condition, which had seemed so promising just hours before, vanished like morning mist as her body convulsed with a seizure that sent her crashing to the ground. "Victoria!" "Mrs." Whitfield screamed, rushing to her side as the young woman's body went rigid with muscle spasms. Foam appeared at the corners of her mouth, and her eyes rolled back until only the whites were visible. "Doctor!" Webb knelt beside her, his hands shaking as he tried to assess what was happening. "This doesn't make sense," he muttered. "She was recovering beautifully. Mountain fever doesn't present with seizures." "Because it's not mountain fever," came a voice from behind them. Everyone turned to see Frank Rivers stepping into their camp with the calm authority of a man who belonged exactly where he was. But there was something different about him now. Gone was the deferential manner of a mountain hermit seeking permission to help. This was someone else entirely. Someone who moved with the confident bearing of a person accustomed to command. "Get away from her, Doctor," Webb shouted, but Frank ignored him completely, kneeling beside Victoria with practiced efficiency. "Mrs. Whitfield, I need you to hold her head steady," Frank commanded, his voice carrying the unmistakable authority of someone who had dealt with medical emergencies countless times before. "Thomas, I need clean water and any laudanum you have in your supplies. Now." "I'm not taking orders from a vagrant," Clearwater began, but something in Frank's eyes stopped him cold. "My name is Dr. Franklin Rivers," Frank said clearly, never taking his attention from Victoria's convulsing form. "I graduated from Johns Hopkins Medical College in 1856, completed advanced surgical training in Edinburgh, and served as Chief Medical Officer for the Army of the West during the Indian Wars. This woman is experiencing systemic lupus crisis brought on by inadequate treatment of her condition." The words fell into the camp like stones into still water, creating ripples of shock that spread through everyone present. Dr. Webb's face went pale as the implications of this revelation sank in. "Impossible," he whispered. "Dr. Franklin Rivers died years ago. Lost at Fort Davidson during the cholera outbreak. I didn't die," Frank said grimly, working with swift precision to stabilize Victoria's condition. "Though there were times I wished I had." As Frank worked, Mrs. Whitfield found her voice. "The wanted poster," she breathed. "I remember now. Dr. Franklin Rivers, you were wanted for questioning about medical malpractice. They said you abandoned your post, that you fled rather than face charges." "They said a lot of things," Frank replied, carefully positioning Victoria to prevent her from choking. "Most of them were lies designed to cover up the Army's failure to prevent a preventable epidemic." From his medical bag, a leather case that had been hidden in his mountain cabin for 15 years, Frank produced instruments and medicines that were far more sophisticated than anything Dr. Webb carried. His movements were those of a surgeon who had operated under fire, someone for whom life and death decisions were routine rather than crisis. The official story, Frank continued as he worked, was that Dr. Franklin Rivers abandoned his post during a cholera outbreak, leaving soldiers and civilians to die while he fled to avoid responsibility. The truth was that I stayed at my post for 72 hours straight, trying to save everyone I could with inadequate supplies and no support from command. Victoria's seizure was beginning to subside under Frank's expert care, but her condition remained critical. Frank's hands moved with the precision of a master craftsman as he prepared an injection that would stabilize her nervous system. The cholera outbreak at Fort Davidson was caused by contaminated water supplies that I had warned about for weeks. Frank continued, his voice steady despite the emotional weight of the story he was telling. My reports were ignored because fixing the problem would have cost money the army didn't want to spend. When people started dying, they needed someone to blame. Dr. Webb found his voice, though it came out as little more than a croak. But the court-martial, the official findings, were written by the same officers who had ignored my warnings in the first place, Frank said. I was a convenient scapegoat for their negligence. The charges would have been dropped eventually. I had too many witnesses to the truth, but by then it was too late. Too late for what? Mrs. Whitfield asked. Frank's hands stilled for a moment, and when he spoke, his voice carried 15 years of accumulated grief. Too late for my wife Sarah and my daughter Anna. They died in that outbreak, victims of the same contaminated water I had tried to get command to address. When I lost them, I lost everything that mattered about being Dr. Franklin Rivers. The camp fell silent, except for the sound of Victoria's labored breathing. Frank's revelation had reframed everything they thought they understood about the mysterious mountain man who had been following their party. So you disappeared, Clearwater said quietly. I walked away from everything, Frank confirmed. Let them think I was dead. Let them close the case with their convenient lies. I came to these mountains to die, but the land had other plans for me. Victoria stirred then, her eyes fluttering open with the slow confusion of someone emerging from a medical crisis. Frank immediately focused his attention on her, checking her pulse and pupil response with the practiced efficiency that had made him legendary in army medical circles. How do you feel? He asked gently. Like I've been trampled by horses, Victoria replied weakly. What happened? Systemic crisis, Frank explained. Your condition is more advanced than I initially diagnosed. The lupus has begun affecting your nervous system, which means the treatment protocol needs to be completely revised. Dr. Webb, who had been silent since Frank's revelation, finally spoke. This is impossible. If you're really Dr. Franklin Rivers, then you're supposed to be dead, Frank smiled grimly. In every way that mattered, I was. But this woman needs the doctor I used to be, not the hermit I became. The question is whether any of you can accept help from someone whose existence contradicts everything you think you know about honor and duty. Victoria struggled to sit up, her mind reeling from both the physical trauma and the emotional impact of Frank's story. You let me believe you were just a mountain man with some folk knowledge about plants. It was easier than explaining why a supposedly dead army surgeon was living alone in the wilderness, Frank replied. And frankly, after 15 years of exile, I wasn't sure I was still the doctor you needed. And now, Frank met her eyes with steady honesty, now I know that some obligations transcend personal comfort. You're going to die without proper medical care, and despite everything I've lost, I'm still the person with the knowledge to save you. The wanted poster that Thomas Clearwater produced from his saddlebags confirmed Frank's identity beyond doubt. The face in the sketch was younger, cleaner, but unmistakably the same man who now knelt beside Victoria in the wilderness. Across the top, in bold letters, were the words, Dr. Franklin Rivers, wanted for questioning in connection with medical malpractice and abandonment of military post. But the date on the poster was 15 years old, and the charges had been dropped long ago when the truth about Fort Davidson finally came to light. Frank Rivers was no longer a wanted man. He was simply a broken healer who had found his calling again in the last place anyone would think to look. In the hours following Frank's revelation, Victoria's condition deteriorated with frightening speed. The seizure had marked a turning point in her illness. What had been a manageable skin condition was now becoming a systemic disease that threatened every organ in her body. Frank worked with the focused intensity of a surgeon preparing for the most critical operation of his career, knowing that without immediate intervention, Victoria would not survive another day. "I need to perform surgery," Frank announced, his statement falling into the camp like a thunderclap. "The lupus has triggered an inflammatory response that's attacking her kidneys and nervous system. Without surgical intervention to relieve the pressure on her brain, she'll be dead by morning." Dr. Webb, who had been silent since Frank's identity was revealed, finally found his voice. "Surgery? Here? In the wilderness? That's madness. She needs to be transported to a proper medical facility." "The nearest hospital is 4 days away," Frank replied grimly. "She doesn't have 4 hours, let alone 4 days. This has to happen now, and it has to happen here." Frank retrieved his surgical kit from where he had hidden it in his mountain cabin, a leather case that he hadn't opened in 15 years. Inside, wrapped in oiled cloth, were instruments that had saved countless lives during his army service: scalpels, forceps, bone saws, and other tools of precision medicine that seemed almost mystical in their mountain setting. The surgical instruments gleamed in the afternoon sunlight as Frank laid them out with the systematic care of someone for whom such preparations had once been routine. Each tool carried memories: the Battle of Bear Creek, where he had operated for 18 hours straight; the typhoid outbreak at Fort Collins, where his quick thinking had saved an entire garrison; the countless smaller emergencies where his skill had meant the difference between life and death. But this was different. This wasn't a military hospital with trained assistants and proper supplies. This was wilderness surgery with improvised equipment, and the patient was someone who had come to represent everything he had lost and everything he might still redeem. Victoria, despite her weakened condition, insisted on remaining conscious for the preparations. "I want to understand what you're doing," she said, her voice barely above a whisper, but carrying the determination that had sustained her family through generations of challenges. Frank knelt beside her, his weathered hands gentle as he explained the procedure. "The lupus has caused inflammation in your brain that's creating dangerous pressure. I need to make a small opening in your skull to relieve that pressure and prevent permanent damage. It's a delicate operation under the best circumstances, and these aren't the best circumstances." "What are the risks?" Frank met her eyes with the honesty that had defined his approach to medicine throughout his career. "Death, paralysis, permanent brain damage. But without the surgery, death is certain. With it, you have a chance." Victoria nodded, accepting the brutal mathematics of survival that had governed life on the frontier since the first settlers had crossed the Mississippi. "What do you need me to do?" "Trust me," Frank said simply, "and if you have any final words for your family, now might be the time to write them." While Frank prepared his instruments, Victoria composed a letter to her father with hands that shook from both illness and emotion. The words came slowly, each sentence carrying the weight of things she had never thought to say. "Dearest Papa," she wrote, "I am writing this in the Colorado mountains under circumstances I could never have imagined. If you are reading this, it means that my journey has ended differently than we planned. I want you to know that I have learned things about courage and grace that no finishing school could have taught me. I have learned that wisdom and worth are not measured by wealth or social position, but by the willingness to help others when help is needed most." She paused, thinking about Frank's story and the years he had spent in exile, carrying grief and guilt that belonged to other men. "I have met someone who embodies everything we claim to value about honor and service, but he is someone our world would never recognize or acknowledge. His name is Dr. Franklin Rivers, and he has given me a gift more precious than all the silver in our mines. He has given me the chance to see who I really am when everything else is stripped away." Frank, meanwhile, was confronting his own emotional preparation for what lay ahead. His father's pocket watch, a gift from his graduation from medical school, ticked steadily in his vest pocket, the same watch that had timed countless surgeries during his army career. Each tick reminded him of the weight of time and the precision required to preserve life under impossible circumstances. The memories came flooding back as he sharpened his instrument, Sarah's face when he had proposed, Anna's laughter during their Sunday walks, the pride in his parents' eyes when he had received his commission as an army surgeon. All of it had died with them at Fort Davidson, buried under guilt and grief that had driven him into the wilderness. But now, preparing to operate on Victoria in conditions that would challenge even the most experienced surgeon, Frank felt something he hadn't experienced in 15 years, the return of purpose that had originally driven him to medicine. This wasn't just about saving one woman's life. It was about reclaiming his identity as a healer and proving that some callings transcend personal pain. "Dr. Rivers," Mrs. Whitfield said softly, approaching him as he made his final preparations. "Thank you for not giving up on her." Frank looked up from his instruments, seeing in the older woman's face the same desperate love he had once felt for his own family. "Mrs. Whitfield, I need you to understand something. This surgery is dangerous under any circumstances, and these circumstances are far from ideal. If something goes wrong, it won't," she interrupted with quiet conviction. "I've watched you work, seen how you handle every situation with knowledge and care. Victoria trusts you, and so do I." As the sun began its descent toward the western peaks, Frank made his final preparations. He had chosen a spot near the stream where the light would be best and the ground most level. Clean cloths were arranged for bandages, hot water was ready for sterilization, and laudanum was prepared to manage Victoria's pain during the procedure. Thomas Clearwater, who had been silent since the revelation of Frank's identity, finally approached the makeshift operating area. "Doctor," he said, the title carrying respect that hadn't been there before, "what can I do to help?" "Keep the area clear and quiet," Frank replied, "and be ready to assist if I need extra hands. This kind of surgery requires absolute precision." Dr. Webb, whose pride had taken a devastating blow, watched the preparations with the conflicted expression of a man seeing his professional inadequacy exposed. "This is still madness," he muttered, but his protest lacked conviction. "No," Victoria said clearly from her position on the improvised operating table. "Madness would be dying from pride when knowledge and courage are available to save me." As the golden hour light began to fade, Frank took his position beside Victoria, his surgical instruments arranged with military precision. In his mind, he could hear the voices of his medical school professors, the guidance of senior surgeons who had trained him, and most clearly, the words of his wife Sarah on the day he had received his army commission, "Go save lives, Franklin, that's what you were born to do." For 15 years, he had run from that calling. Now, with Victoria's life hanging in the balance and darkness approaching the Colorado wilderness, Dr. Franklin Rivers was finally ready to answer it again. "Ah, you ready?" he asked Victoria, his voice steady despite the enormity of what lay ahead. "I'm ready," she replied, her hand finding his for a moment of connection that bridged the vast social distance between them. "Save my life, Dr. Rivers, and maybe save yourself in the process." The surgery began as the last golden light of day painted the Colorado peaks in shades of amber and rose. Frank had positioned Victoria so that the fading sunlight would give him the clearest view of his work, knowing that once darkness fell, he would be operating by firelight, a prospect that would have terrified most surgeons, but was simply another challenge for a man who had learned his craft in army field hospitals. Victoria clutched her locket, a small silver pendant containing photographs of her parents, as Frank administered the laudanum that would dull her pain without rendering her completely unconscious. The procedure he was about to perform required her to remain responsive, able to answer questions that would tell him whether he was causing damage to critical areas of her brain. "Can you feel this?" Frank asked, testing her reflexes with gentle pressure on her hand. Yes, Victoria replied, her voice steady despite the circumstances. The laudanum had taken the edge off her pain, but she remained alert enough to understand the gravity of what was happening. Frank's first incision was made with the precision that had earned him his reputation during the Indian Wars. The scalpel moved through skin and tissue with the confident accuracy of a man who had performed this procedure dozens of times under conditions that ranged from battlefield triage to emergency surgery in frontier outposts. Mrs. Whitfield knelt beside Victoria, holding her hand and providing the steady emotional support that would help her through the ordeal. "You're doing beautifully, dear," she whispered, though her own voice shook with barely controlled fear. As Frank worked deeper, exposing the delicate structures beneath Victoria's scalp, he felt the familiar rhythm of surgical concentration settling over him. This was the state of mind that had sustained him through 18-hour operations, where time seemed to slow and every movement became deliberate and precise. It was a feeling he had missed more than he had ever admitted to himself. "I can see the inflammation clearly now," Frank announced to his improvised surgical team. "The pressure buildup is significant, but the damage appears to be reversible if we can relieve it quickly enough." Thomas Clearwater, who had positioned himself to assist with instruments, watched with fascination as Frank's scarred hands moved with the delicacy of an artist. "How do you know exactly where to cut?" he asked in whispered amazement. "Years of study, years of practice, and years of making mistakes that taught me how to avoid making them again," Frank replied, without taking his eyes from his work. "Every surgeon carries the memory of every patient they've treated, successful or not." The most delicate moment came when Frank reached the point where he needed to relieve the pressure on Victoria's brain without causing damage to the surrounding tissue. This was surgery that required not just skill, but intuition. The ability to read the subtle signs that distinguished healthy tissue from diseased, normal pressure from dangerous buildup. "Victoria, I need you to tell me if you experience any changes in vision or sensation," Frank instructed. "Any tingling, numbness, or visual disturbances." "I understand," she replied, her voice remarkably calm for someone undergoing brain surgery in a wilderness camp. Frank made the critical adjustment with movements so small they were barely visible, relieving the pressure that had been threatening Victoria's life while preserving the delicate neural pathways that controlled her motor functions and cognitive abilities. It was the kind of precision work that separated competent surgeons from legendary ones. "Pressure's releasing," Frank announced with quiet satisfaction. "I can see the inflammation beginning to subside already." Dr. Webb, who had been watching from a distance with a mixture of professional jealousy and grudging admiration, finally approached the operating area. "The technique you're using, I've never seen anything quite like it. Edinburgh surgical training combined with battlefield innovation," Frank explained, continuing his meticulous work. "When you're operating under fire with inadequate supplies, you learn to improvise techniques that wouldn't be taught in any medical school." As Frank began the delicate process of closing the surgical site, Victoria demonstrated the remarkable courage that had sustained her family through generations of challenges. Despite the trauma of the procedure, she remained conscious and responsive, answering Frank's questions with clarity that reassured him about her neurological status. "How do you feel?" Frank asked as he placed the final sutures. "Like I've been given my life back," Victoria replied, tears streaming down her face, tears of relief, gratitude, and a profound understanding of how close she had come to death. Frank's hands, which had been steady throughout the surgery, began to shake slightly as the adrenaline of the procedure started to fade. He had performed successful brain surgery under conditions that would have been considered impossible by most medical standards. More importantly, he had reclaimed his identity as a healer and proven to himself that the skills that had once made him legendary had not been lost to 15 years of self-imposed exile. "The surgery is complete," Frank announced to the assembled group. "Now we wait and see how well she responds to the recovery process." The first critical hours after surgery passed with agonizing slowness. Frank maintained a constant vigil beside Victoria, monitoring her vital signs with the practiced attention of a physician who understood that successful surgery was only the beginning of the healing process. His father's pocket watch marked each hour with steady precision, counting down the time that would determine whether his intervention had truly saved her life. Victoria drifted in and out of consciousness, her body fighting to recover from both the disease that had nearly killed her and the trauma of the surgery that had saved her. Each time she opened her eyes, Frank was there checking her pulse, examining her pupils for signs of brain damage, adjusting her position to prevent complications. "The fever's breaking, Mrs. Whitfield observed during the third hour, pressing her hand to Victoria's forehead with the practiced touch of someone who had nursed many through serious illness. Frank nodded, allowing himself the first moment of cautious optimism since the surgery began. Her body's responding well to the pressure relief. The inflammation that was threatening her brain function is starting to subside. As dawn approached, Victoria's periods of consciousness became longer and more coherent. She was able to answer Frank's questions about her vision, her memory, and her motor control, all indicators that the surgery had succeeded without causing the neurological damage that was always a risk with such procedures. "Dr. Rivers," she said during one of these lucid moments, her voice still weak but carrying genuine warmth, "I owe you my life." Frank, who had been checking her bandages, paused in his work. "You don't owe me anything, Victoria. This is what doctors are supposed to do." "But you're not just any doctor, are you?" Victoria replied, studying his face in the flickering light of the campfire. "You're someone who walked away from everything because you couldn't save the people who mattered most to you. And now you've saved someone who should have been nothing more than a stranger." The observation cut deeper than Frank had expected. For 15 years, he had carried the guilt of losing Sarah and Anna, convinced that his failure as a physician had made him unworthy of practicing medicine. But in saving Victoria's life, he had begun to understand something that had eluded him during his years of self-imposed exile. "I think," Frank said quietly, "that sometimes we're given second chances in forms we don't expect. Your illness brought me back to medicine, but your recovery has given me something I thought I'd lost forever." "What's that?" "Faith in my ability to heal rather than harm." Dr. Webb, who had spent the night wrestling with his own professional inadequacy, finally approached Frank as the morning light began to strengthen. "I owe you an apology," he said, his usual pompous manner replaced by genuine humility. "I was so concerned with protecting my reputation that I nearly let a patient die from my ignorance." Frank looked up from his patient care, seeing in Dr. Webb's face the same struggle with professional pride that had once driven Frank himself to dangerous extremes. "We all make mistakes, Doctor. The measure of a physician isn't whether he fails, but whether he learns from those failures." "How do you do it, Doctor?" Webb asked. "How do you carry the weight of life and death decisions without being crushed by the responsibility?" "You don't," Frank replied honestly. "Every patient you lose stays with you forever, but every patient you save reminds you why the weight is worth carrying." Victoria, who had been listening to their conversation, struggled to sit up despite Frank's gentle protests. "Dr. Webb, I want you to know that I don't blame you for misdiagnosing my condition. Frontier medicine is different from what you learned in Philadelphia. But I hope you'll remember this experience the next time someone offers help that doesn't come with proper credentials." The transformation that had taken place in their mountain camp went beyond Victoria's physical recovery. Each member of Godnogea, their party, had been forced to confront assumptions about worth, knowledge, and the sources of genuine expertise. Thomas Clearwater, who had initially dismissed Frank as a vagrant, now sought his advice about everything from treating injured horses to reading weather signs. Mrs. Whitfield, who had risked everything to obtain Frank's help for Victoria, found herself serving as an informal liaison between the formal medical establishment represented by Dr. Webb and the practical frontier knowledge embodied by Frank. Most profoundly, Victoria herself had undergone a transformation that extended far beyond her physical healing. The proud socialite who had begun this journey, convinced of her own superiority, had emerged from her brush with death as someone who understood that survival often depended on humility and the willingness to accept help from unexpected sources. "I keep thinking about what you said," Victoria told Frank as her strength continued to return, "about sometimes being given second chances in forms we don't expect. I think that's what this whole experience has been for both of us." Frank smiled, the first genuine smile anyone had seen from him since his identity had been revealed. "How so?" "You've been given the chance to practice medicine again without the weight of your past failures. And I've been given the chance to discover who I really am when everything I thought defined me is stripped away." As the Colorado sun climbed higher, casting long shadows across their wilderness camp, both Frank and Victoria understood that they had passed through something that had fundamentally changed them. The surgery had saved her life, but the experience had saved something equally important in both of them: the capacity to trust, to heal, and to find redemption in the most unlikely circumstances. 3 weeks later, Victoria stood on the porch of her family's Colorado ranch, her face bearing only faint scars from the ordeal that had nearly claimed her life. The morning sun, which had once triggered the deadly progression of her lupus, now felt warm and welcoming against skin that had healed under Frank's careful ministrations. In her hands, she held a simple wooden cross that Frank had carved for her during her recovery, a reminder of their time together and the lessons learned in the wilderness. The cross was rough-hewn, made from mountain pine with Frank's own hands during the long hours when he had watched over her recovery. It bore no resemblance to the elaborate religious artifacts that adorned her family's Boston home, but it carried a significance that transcended its humble appearance. Every groove in the wood spoke of patience, care, and the quiet faith that had sustained both of them through the darkest hours of her illness. Frank had left 2 days earlier, declining Victoria's invitation to stay at the ranch as her family's honored guest. "I don't belong in your world," he had said with gentle finality, "and you don't belong in mine. But what we shared in those mountains that belongs to both of us forever." Before departing, Frank had made Victoria promise to continue the medical regimen that would keep her lupus in remission. More importantly, he had extracted her word that she would use her position and influence to help others who found themselves in circumstances similar to her own, dependent on the mercy of strangers and the knowledge of those society typically overlooked. "Promise me," he had said, "that you'll remember what it felt like to need help from someone your world would dismiss. Promise me you'll use that memory to build bridges instead of walls." Victoria had promised, and she intended to keep that promise in ways that would have seemed impossible before her illness transformed her understanding of the world. The letter she was writing to her father would be the first step in that transformation. In careful, measured prose, she detailed not just her illness and recovery, but the broader implications of what she had learned about frontier medicine, social prejudice, and the sources of genuine wisdom. "Dearest Papa," she wrote, "I am writing to propose the establishment of the Rivers Foundation for Frontier Medical Care, to be funded entirely by our family's resources and dedicated to providing medical training and supplies to underserved communities throughout the Western Territories. This foundation will be named in honor of Dr. Franklin Rivers, the physician who saved my life and opened my eyes to possibilities I had never considered. The foundation, as Victoria envisioned it, would send trained medical personnel to frontier communities that lacked adequate health care. More importantly, it would work to bridge the gap between formal medical education and the practical knowledge that men like Frank had developed through years of frontier experience. Victoria's transformation extended beyond her newfound medical advocacy. The proud socialite who had begun this journey, convinced of her own superiority, now understood that true strength came from acknowledging one's limitations and seeking help from those with greater knowledge, regardless of their social standing. Mrs. Whitfield, who had become something closer to a friend than a servant during their ordeal, found Victoria easier to work with but also more challenging. The young woman who had once been content to follow social conventions now questioned everything, seeking to understand the reasoning behind traditions that she had previously accepted without thought. "You've changed, dear," Mrs. Whitfield observed as Victoria sealed the letter to her father. "Not just recovered, truly changed." "I hope so," Victoria replied. "I hope I never again become the kind of person who would dismiss someone like Frank Rivers because of his appearance or circumstances." 6 months after Victoria's recovery, the transformation of both their lives was complete in ways that neither could have anticipated. Victoria's foundation had become a reality, funded by Pembroke Family Resources and staffed by physicians who understood that healing often required knowledge that couldn't be found in medical textbooks. Frank, meanwhile, had returned to practicing medicine in a small frontier town where his skills were desperately needed, and his past was irrelevant to people who measured worth by results rather than reputation. The wanted posters that had once made him a fugitive had long since been forgotten, replaced by a different kind of recognition, the quiet respect of people whose lives he had saved and whose suffering he had eased. The wooden cross that Victoria treasured had been matched by a letter that Frank carried in his medical bag, a simple note she had written, thanking him not just for saving her life, but for teaching her how to see the world through eyes unclouded by privilege and prejudice. "Dr. Rivers," the letter read, "you gave me more than medical treatment in those mountains. You gave me the gift of understanding that wisdom and worth cannot be measured by wealth or social position, but only by the willingness to help others when help is needed most. I will carry that lesson with me for the rest of my life, and I will use every resource at my disposal to ensure that others have access to the kind of knowledge and care you provided when I needed it most." On quiet evenings in his new practice, Frank would read Victoria's letter and remember the frightened socialite who had become a bridge between worlds that had previously existed in mutual ignorance. Their encounter in the Colorado wilderness had saved more than her life. It had restored his faith in the possibility of redemption and her understanding of what truly mattered in a world where survival often depended on the kindness of strangers. The mountains that had witnessed their unlikely partnership continued to stand unchanged, indifferent to human struggles, but somehow blessed by the knowledge that sometimes, in the vast wilderness of the frontier, two souls could find exactly what they needed in the last place they thought to look, in each other's courage, wisdom, and unexpected grace.